We have been studying Sri Aurobindo's description in the Life Divine of the transition in rebirth and the content that is actually carried into the new birth and the whole logic of rebirth itself. Some important ideas to recapitulate. First, that we have to make a distinction between the soul itself and the personality which it puts forward. The soul is immortal. The personality that it forms, consisting of mind, life energy, and a physical body, is temporary, with a very narrow focus for a particular line of experience which the soul wants to have for its development. It is not the soul itself which is the personality, but the personality is what it takes on almost like a mask, which it has to shed when it withdraws from the life, as we discussed earlier, through three stages: shedding the physical body, the vital body, and the mental body, which are all three dissolved, but retaining the essential elements of the growth and the experience of learning. And the personality, Sri Aurobindo points out, is formed again anew depending on the line of experience that it chooses, drawing from all past personalities to the extent that it finds necessary and helpful for the purpose that it wants in this life. Over a series of lives, over a long period of time, there is a gathering of a variety of formations which have been used in the past, developed to whatever degree, and which represent a kind of a storehouse of capacities and past development, which make for the rich play in the present and possibility for the future. And the more numerous these veiled personalities are, the more rich the new personality, the more complexity in the development, there is a clear sense that this person who is growing through these personalities is ready for a leap in evolution to the next stage beyond the mental evolution. And the more these personalities are harmonized, the more we recognize an advanced stage of the individual's evolution. In this scheme, the false importance which our mind attaches to memory of past lives goes away. We realize even that memory of past life, that is of past personality, would hinder the possibility of the new experience in the new personality. And so it is even necessary for those memories to be set aside, to be erased. Because this text of the Life Divine is intended to present every viewpoint and even contradictions of different approaches. Sri Aurobindo takes great pains, as we saw last time, to present different religious or philosophical viewpoints, some of which even declare that the surface personality may not remember, but the soul looks back and has this experience of learning from the good and the bad of the personality, and so on. But Sri Aurobindo points out that the whole idea of rebirth being for the sake of virtue and overcoming of vice, of reward and punishment, becomes not only foolish, but also illogical once we look at things in depth in this manner. So the whole purpose is growth, not reward or punishment. In the last paragraph that we read, Sri Aurobindo highlighted the serious obstacle that the prolongation of the old temperament of character can bring in the free development of the soul, and which would bind you into a useless repetition of past experiences or limitations. And the focus he brings is on the soul personality growing. So we have to now add to our perspective this new term of vocabulary. There is the surface personality which is put on as a mask, and then there is a soul personality which is evolving, which is an aspect of the soul's maturity and the soul's growth. And this soul personality is gathering in sum the experiences of the past for a growth which makes it rich and complex. This soul personality will infuse itself into the material of the surface personality, as if informing it with certain tendencies or values which it has brought from past development, from which it can draw out facets of achievement, of experience as necessary for a situation that appears before you, a challenge that appears before you. And all of these are being gathered on the inner level of which we are not conscious on the surface. Sri Aurobindo gives in passing an example, which we saw last time, as a tree grows by subconscient or inconscient assimilation of action of sun and rain and wind and absorption of earth elements, so the being grows by subliminal or intraconscient assimilation and absorption of its results of past becoming and an output of potentialities of future becoming. Now this we have seen last time already, but I want to draw attention to this, to view it now from a deeper insight. You have to keep in mind that Sri Aurobindo never wastes a single word, and every word is very carefully selected for all the nuances which it carries. And he does not especially waste an analogy of this kind. He has used a tree earlier in a different context when he discusses the development of the tree from a seed as an example for how forms emerge from a seed idea. And this was in context of what he has described as a supramental real idea, which is like a seed containing itself the full potential of the development. And there he gave this example that the entire tree as if lives inside the seed. In the seed you do not see any sign of the tree, neither its size, nor its material, nor its capacities. None of these exist inside the seed. And yet, all these potentially are held in the seed and drawn out by some seemingly miraculous process. Now again, he gives the example of a tree growing by subconscient or inconscient assimilation. And he links it or makes a similarity to the being growing by subliminal or intraconscient assimilation and absorption. And this past example and the present example join when we look deeply. Remember, the seed is carrying a potentiality. And like the real idea in the supermind, it knows as if everything of what it should do, when it should do, according to a situation. And depending on the kind of soil it has, depending on the opportunity it receives with the water, with the air, with the sun, it takes all that material that comes, none of which can be pre-planned. The seed may grow in semi-arid conditions, it may grow in extremes of water, and yet it adapts. And as it grows, it may be stamped upon by somebody, the stalk that is growing may be crushed, and yet it knows how to rebuild itself. A gardener may come and cut the plant in many different ways, and yet it knows how to heal and grow. And if somehow the seasonal variations of temperature are not quite what they should be, it still knows how to retain how to hold back its energy and then flower once again when the correct season comes. Extraordinarily complex knowledge and power to actualize that knowledge is held in the seed, but the seed itself has nothing of the material of the tree. It gathers the material from outside. It forms that material with the knowledge and the will, so to say, that it carries and shapes the form of the tree. And as the plant grows, the seed itself seems to vanish. We do not see anymore the seed. This pure knowledge will now lives inside the new body form that is created out of new gathered material upon which it continues to build, and from which then it throws out new seeds. And each of those seeds carries in it as if this knowledge will material with all the knowledge and power required to form an entire new tree in a completely different environment and circumstance. And so this relationship is interesting to see, and you relate it to the soul and the personality on the surface. Here Sri Aurobindo has taken the example of how the seed grows by a subconscious or inconscient assimilation of action. And then he lists sun, rain, wind, and absorption of earth elements. Now it's very significant. It's almost like an example you could give to a little child, but Sri Aurobindo is not handling it on that level alone. If you look deeply, he is speaking of the four elements: the air, fire, water, and earth. The four elements from which the seed is drawing material to form the body, and at the same time, from the experience of the body formed of these four elements and their impact on the body, it gathers experience to grow. So a tree grows by subconscious or inconscient assimilation of action of sun and rain and wind and absorption of earth elements. Who is growing and who is the tree? Not the body of the material it has gathered, but this consciousness that lives inside it, which is built of this knowledge and will, which manages this body. And so, in the same way, the being grows by a subliminal or intraconscient assimilation and absorption of its results of past becoming. Now here the analogy first on the deeper side, we too in our surface personality are formed of these materials, the four elements which are gathered. And it's as if the fifth element, which you do not see, you never feel, is the power and the knowledge within of the soul, which gathers the material, forms it, lives in it, and then gathers experiences from it. And in this case, the analogy goes much further than the seed and the tree. All the past lives and all their experiences are absorbed through those formations created with the four elements each time. And the result of all this is held and preparing for an output of potentialities of future becoming. So this I wanted to dwell upon before we move forward. Now the next paragraph which we will begin considers the example of an existing life and how we lose memory and yet retain personality as we go along. And with this example, he builds a whole perspective on what is the nature of the content that is carried, and how, in spite of forgetting specifics, the growth of the personality still continues. And at a certain stage of the development, the retention of past memories on some deeper level can actually be made available to the surface personality. What is the relationship of those memories with the surface personality? And this will prepare us for a much richer and more important discussion, which will be how then can the growing personality actually participate in the soul's growth and not be merely a mask, but an actual expression of the soul consciously. As things are, look at a child, the outer predominates the inner in most cases. And especially with the system of education that we have, we encourage the predominance of the outer. So if a child is sitting and daydreaming or sitting in the garden and feeling the space, the parents come, why are you wasting your time? Go out and do something. Read your book, do your homework, talk to someone. The sense of being quiet is seen, or to be introspective, is seen to be somehow a waste of time. And you drive them to push forward more and more. In the school system, you reward the more extrovert child. The introvert is often seen as not interesting or daydreaming or lazy or some criticism. Whereas the child who's pushing forward and doing things is praised, oh, this guy is so creative and so. Whereas the one introspecting may be creating in his mind, but we don't recognize that. So the values have all been externalized to such a degree that there's a pressure for the child to conform and even a push to ignore the inner and exaggerate the outer turn. The result is, as the growth proceeds, the outer personality forms with false values, false perverse habits or ideas which cover the inner. And remember, the whole journey of life is led by the inner nudging the outer. And the more the surface becomes hard, the inner struggles to nudge the outer. It nudges with very little result. And at some point, the outer may be so perverse, so blocked up and dark, that the inner feels suffocated. Which is often the case when the personality becomes extremely crude or perverse from bad habits, and the personality has even got into habits which harm evolution of itself and others. And the inner personality is blocked, unable to push forward, and it suffers. If the inner being is sufficiently developed, it may even consciously call for help from above, from the divine. And the divine response would then come to assist in correcting this perversion. And if it cannot do it by a series of external nudges, it may do it by a shock or a blow that shatters the surface personality and gives the chance for the inner to come forward. And we have many examples, perhaps in our own lives. We've seen people who had a powerful shock, sometimes even a physical accident, and their personality underwent a change. Most often this happens when someone has had a near-death experience. The physical accident led to being exposed briefly to that state outside the surface personality which was knocked out. Being in the subtle body, becoming conscious of something of the inner being and the inner personality while in the subtle. And then you come back and suddenly you're no more the same. Because momentarily this inner part could come forward and imprint itself on the surface memory, and now you're able to continue in the new personality entirely. So you'll say, so-and-so had this great accident, he was unconscious for 3 days, and then after that the whole personality has changed, always for the better. More kind, more loving, more caring, more truly himself or herself. Or a shock causes a deep introspection. What happened? How did this happen? What will happen to me? Someone close to you dies, who's younger than you, and what happens to my life? What if I die? And you start looking for your sense of purpose, and you plunge deep, deep, deep. I'll ask this question: what made you turn in when you had the shock? Why didn't you run to a psychiatrist? Why didn't you run to exteriorize further to fill your hole? You turned in. It's almost as if something inside you reached out and pulled you in. You went to such a depth of introspection that you have never experienced before, and you had no way of knowing it was even possible to go so deep, because the inner being pulled you inward. So it pulled you in by exerting its influence on you as strongly as it could. Occasionally, if the inner being is strong enough, it can push from inside and shatter the outer personality. It doesn't need necessarily the outer help. Or generally there's a double action of it pushing intensely to change and then the shock coming from outside, and the two work together. This is the slow, painful process when the outer nature is too rigid and hard. If only our educational system had made from the beginning a connection to the inner being, had made that a reference at each moment that you have a choice, become quiet and feel within your desired nature, in that part deep inside where you're still and calm and you know already what is right. You do not need any external books of reference or training of morality or ethics. The moment you start doing something wrong, this inner sensitivity will say, I don't feel nice, I can't do this. The problem with this kind of upbringing would of course be a deep sensitivity, a rich inner life, which would not fit the expectations that current society has for you to be somehow always pushing and dominating and asserting and subduing others so that you may win. They're completely contrary values. And such a person will generally find himself to be a misfit in life, will struggle a lot. Or if, having learned to be sufficiently coarse on the surface, he begins a practice of meditation or asanas or pranayam, which begins an interiorization, the first thing that happens is a growing inner sensitivity with which he finds the very things he used to do before now to be suffocating or now difficult to manage because of the growth of the sensitivity. And I remember sitting in a group discussion in a spiritual community where someone who had just joined a few months before said, you know, for the last few months that I'm coming here and I'm going through this practice, I can't bear anymore what's happening around me. And I'm struggling, please, what can I do? And everybody in the group laughed and said, oh yeah, welcome home. Because it's an experience everybody has. And then what do you do? If the first movement is of sensitization, which makes you more vulnerable, it feels as if the spiritual life is not going to make you strong enough for that crude battle among the savages of humanity. But the reality is, having acquired that sensitivity, there is also the strength within which begins now to grow. And if the practice assists that process of building a poise of equality and drawing out from the inner strength, one comes forward with a far greater strength and resilience with the sensitivity still intact. I remember a friend of mine narrating this. It was a very fascinating example, and I heard it recently a few months ago. He said he was in his late teenage, I think, or just crossing that, when his father passed away. And this was in Sri Lanka. He was used to a certain procedure when somebody dies. Immediately after, whoever is present, they begin to do a certain chant, an invocation, a prayer for the smooth transition. But at the moment where the father passed away, he was there, his siblings, and mother and grandmother and others. And everybody was stunned, numb from the state and shock and the disorientation of this. And only two people, his mother was the one and his grandmother, only two people in his life he saw who had that resilience. His mother began to chant, who should have been the most moved perhaps in some ways. And she began to chant with a strength, which was amazing. He said, I've never seen that. And then it gave strength to others to chant. And so looking back at his life, he said, only my grandmother and my mother are the two people who were connected with Pondicherry, and I saw this strength only in them and nobody else in my family. Those who did not have the Pondi connection didn't have this. What was it in them? And it started a whole introspective process. What was it in them that gave them that resilience? What was coming from Pondicherry that gave them that? And obviously the conclusion was there's something about the spirituality which they imbibed, which gave them that strength. And it comes from the deep presence within, which is itself, although sensitive, carrying also the strength, the resilience, the poise of equality, and over time also draws out the power aspect of the soul, as well as the knowledge aspect of the soul, until it can draw out potentially, like the seed growing to become the tree, the fullness of omniscience and omnipotence in the love of the divine, which it must pour out equally. And all these are meant to be its completeness, each in its own way. But all that is waiting as a latent presence. But first, what happens when it puts itself out is this sensitivity, which does not match the current values of a coarse society. But if society was sensitive, these would be cherished. That society is not, is a pity. Sri Aurobindo makes this observation that in all of human history, there has never been such an extreme crudeness and coarseness in the turn to matter as we see today. And he's describing this 100 years ago. And this extreme turn to matter and the coarseness and crudeness that it has brought. The exaggeration of matter which denies everything else, and anything higher and finer and more beautiful is as if thrown out in this. We have had cycles where matter was given great importance, but those finer things were also held. It's the reason why you see today, when you go to any of the old cultures, beauty, love of art in some way, some sense of aesthetics in the common man. And today, you do not find that aesthetics in the common art. The most popular, most high-selling of art has a crudeness and coarseness. The most popular top-of-the-charts music has a coarseness and numbing effect. You go into any public space, hotels, lobbies, the music that's being played, they call it muzak, is pointless, aimless, dry, repetitive, numbing on some level, hypnotic even in a way. Nothing uplifting, nothing joyous, nothing happy. It's as if those values have been set aside as somehow meaningless, unreal, fake. And the crudeness, coarseness, desensitizing influences have been projected as the ideal. And this complete reversal of values you see worsening over the last few decades. Now, it's not true in our individual lives. All of us yearn for something more beautiful, but when you reach out into that space, you do not find it in the public space, in the public discourse. Why? And children growing up today are as if brought up with that kind of harmful experience. I have been now increasingly to every college or university that I have visited. I find the numbers of children smoking. The problems of children at the age of 15 or 16 taking to alcohol or drugs is only increasing. And all of these are coarsening influences which cut off from the inner influence. They create a barrier, a smoky layer which blocks or even distorts some elements of the inner, or opens through drugs to the inner layers on the most crude part of the vital worlds, exposing you to influences and suggestions from those domains, when in fact the inner should be opening to the higher spiritual. And so everything you find today is towards this contrary influence. And yet, in spite of that, and for all of us here at least, the inner being pushed forward and asserted its influence and gave to the surface personality a forward spiritual turn. Otherwise, we would not be interested in something like this or following the kinds of life or practice that we do. And that's because the inner had grown sufficiently strong that in spite of these things, it could overcome. And so this is the transition point he is referring to. At a certain stage of development of the being, when the inner begins to predominate over the outer and come to the front, it begins to predominate. Once it begins to predominate, there may be many lives where that inner predomination grows. Or within a single life, you may still have the outer dominating in the early stages of childhood, and then the inner pushing forward to assert itself, but in each successive life with greater capacity. Until not only it can begin to dominate, but it can begin to come forward. And this experience, this vocabulary of coming forward is very important. Sri Aurobindo uses this phrase, emerge or come forward, in relation to the psychic being in our personal growth. That we not only grow conscious of the divine presence within and our deepest soul and psychic being, but we create an external conducive environment that its influence can begin to grow more, and then its presence can come forward. And this part of coming forward is when its influence grows to such a degree that it is felt no more as deep, distant and covered up in many layers, but it's felt as if close and in front. Your own sense of identity is no more someone who's turning within to feel the presence within, but you feel the presence itself now filling you, and you as a separate someone becomes thinner and thinner, and emerging presence is the true person. There's a passage of transition where you serve it. It is the divine presence where you invoke it, where you refer to it more and more. But the transition is so smooth that eventually it is you. There is no other separate person. And that's the transition which is referring to here. The inner begins to predominate over the outer and come to the front. Again, accepting this as a process through all the degrees of this emergence, what is described next happens, again in degrees. Past life memory does sometimes begin to emerge, as if from some submerged layer. Does sometimes, it doesn't have to. Because the emerging personality may not have any intention or interest in bringing forward those elements. They may still come. Or it may find it useful to bring forward certain elements of the past life memory. Why? Because it's useful for something to be done now. So only the elements useful will come forward. From where does it come? The feeling is as if some submerged layer. Again, the experience is so, the vocabulary is so precise. It was always there, but it was below the liminal, below the water. And from inside it comes. When it comes forward, you recognize it. Oh yeah, it's as if somewhere within I always knew it. But I'd forgotten that I knew it, and now it comes forward. But what comes? But more readily in the shape of a perception of the stuff and power of past personalities that are effective in the composition of the being in the present life. So, in some past lives perhaps, I may have had a series of developments of a more heroic personality or an adventurous personality or some experience of leadership and courage in the face of extreme problems. In this life, perhaps the personality is more introspective, less adventurous and courageous. But some element of that has been brought forward because the work necessary may be to have a courage in the thought or in action in the field of knowledge. And so some element of that personality is there. And so what emerges as the past life memory is this component and its values that it has brought. And again, he uses very precise vocabulary. The stuff and power of past personalities. It's as if some substance of tendency and that power of standing up in spite of opposition, being willing to sacrifice yourself for an ideal, to cling to what is true, even in the face of extreme distress or consequence. That part comes forward. And you realize that it's not something new. The details of the memory may not be there, but you realize this capacity is in you and it's quite developed and formed. And now it is activated because of the circumstances required or whatever. Or with it, some memory also may be there. I've been in exactly the same kind of situation where I was persecuted, but I held to what was true, and in spite of all things, we overcame. And the memory may not be of overcoming. The memory may have maybe of being persecuted and of losing. But the fact that you could stand through, even be killed at the stake if you stood for what was true and real, the fact that you stood is your survival. You did not compromise, you held to the ideal, and something of that strength stays. So more readily in the shape of a perception of the stuff and power of past personalities that are effective in the composition of the being in the present life. Then, in any precise and accurate detail of event and circumstance. So you don't actually remember all those details, but something feels like that. Although this too can recur in parts. Sometimes a flash may come, oh yes, I had that kind of thing once. But now the consciousness is sufficiently developed that the memory does not bother you. If that memory had come prematurely, when the personality was still the old ego sense, the memory would have seriously disrupted your sense of identity or freedom. But when the inner being has pushed forward and its memory comes, it has already a different way of relating to those events, however traumatic they have been to that personality. I look back and I say, oh yeah, I have done that. Interesting. That's all. And the feeling of the strength or the ability to hold and stand firm, that's the energy of the experience which is retained. Although this too can recur in parts or be recovered by concentration from the subliminal vision. Now it's possible that you feel this and you say, where does it come from? And you can choose to try to recover some specific memory. And he describes now the 3 ways by which this specific memory can be recovered. Recovered by concentration from the subliminal vision, from some secret memory, or from our inner conscious substance. Now, 3 very different kinds of experience. The first is the most superficial of the 3, and the third is the deepest, and you will see how it works. So as you turn in, you feel this, and you try to feel, well, what was it like? And briefly an image comes. I have a memory of standing before a whole group of people who were mocking me and standing firm. Maybe that's what it is. Or I have a memory that we were as a group together, cast out by society, but we stood in the forest, we lived together, and we lived for this ideal and held it. That image or that feel which comes with the image. Or from some secret memory. Now this image comes like a vision. I see a picture. Or a memory comes which carries not just a picture but the feeling of it, more complete. And there I can feel what it was like. I feel the sense of loneliness, the sense of being abandoned by society, but also the sense of being cared for by our community. We were maybe a dozen. That comes as a memory. But it was a secret memory that I had forgotten I had. Or the third, from our inner conscious substance. And this is the most deep. It's as if the substance of the soul is coming forward, and with it you relive the full force of that experience. You are that personality, that memory, the feeling, that sense of what was done. And that's it. You may not recall anything else of the life. You may not recall what food you ate. So if there was a vision, you may have a picture even with clothing or the food eating if that was important. But in this part, you will have just the imprint of the consciousness, and all the other details may not matter at all. Or you may have a combination of all 3. A flash of an image which makes you dwell on it, which draws out the deeper memory, which makes you dwell deeper and calls out the full spiritual content of the experience which the soul carries. Or the reverse. The spiritual content comes, and after a while with it some of the emotions, and then the images build around it. But there are 3 very different experiences, and one could tap any one of them separate from the others. And one can tap, that's the point. So when you go in deep hypnosis, in normal hypnotic regression, you will only tap images. And that's where you can pick up somebody else's images or ideas also. But if you're used to deep meditation, then with or without hypnosis, you can go deep within and touch upon the second and third layers. The third layer is possible only if you're used to being able to go deep enough to remain in deep closeness with your soul, its presence, its aspiration, its light, and its substance. He uses this word substance, from our inner conscious substance, the part which is the substance that has been carried across lives. But this detailed memory is of minor importance to nature, universal nature, in her normal work, and she makes small or no provision for it. So in the way we are formed, in the way the personality and our evolution takes place, nature says, that's not important. She does not make provision for it. If she had made provision for it, then this would be much more frequent or easy. What is her focus? It is the shaping of the future evolution of the being with which she is concerned. The past is put back, kept behind the veil, and used only as an occult source of materials for the present and future. It's valuable, but as a hidden source. Its material comes forward as needed, but you don't care where it comes from, you don't care what content it had of those lives. What is important is what you do with it now for the future. And so this is the orientation he gives to the whole thing of nature's purpose. This also should be our purpose. Idle curiosity increasingly becomes meaningless when one grows in the presence of the soul. As long as it was just the mind personality, in teenage you would say, oh yeah, it would be so nice to know what was the past. I was so and so, I did such and such. No, it's not. But when the soul comes forward, even if you were told those things, what does it matter? I'm here, this is what is important. What I'm working for, which is the whole soul's vision, that is what matters. And only to the extent it helps, you may draw out what is required. But even that, as needed for the future. Now this orientation is extremely important, because the next paragraph will tell us what we need to do in our surface personality to align to the soul's purpose, and how it can then even take elements of this personality and use it across lives, which would permit an actual conscious continuity of personality across lives without any of the problems of a narrow, rigid personality. Your personality would have to become as flexible as the soul's need is. Your personality should be able to be as rich and expressive of the soul's consciousness as it wants. Then you can make this transition without needing to throw aside a form and material and rebuild each time. And this is going to be the key for us in this part of the study. So for now, what is important for us is to put in context. I remember in my childhood this very clear sense. It had happened that at some point when the mother named me, there was a mention of some past incarnation and so on. And so people around me would sometimes go, dib, 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 you know, you were someone. Okay. And always clearly in the consciousness, there was a strong sense of no. No looking back, no looking around. This is the focus. And there was a very clear sense of not identifying or associating with anything of the inheritance, of the family, of the biology, even of the psychology. There's something extremely important where the whole personality has to be new created with the new material that the mother is bringing in this new consciousness, in this new substance, for a future which is a leap forward that has nothing to do with the past. This sense, which now I can articulate with a conscious intelligence, was there in the child form in an instinctive way. And if there was anything which came, which tended to want to associate with the past or with the biological heredity or family connections, it would just cut off and refuse and block it. It created certain blocks in the personality because of that strong instinctive protection. But it was clear that it was the choice of the soul that it had imprinted in the personality to protect from this mixture of anything which belonged to the past evolutionary work. And the full focus was this new consciousness, this new possibility, and a total dedication and living in the future and having nothing to do with the past. Today I can look back and value it for what it was. At that time it was a confusing experience, although one knew what had to be done. And I'm seeing this, I'm looking at this last sentence in this context for all of us, that whatever we may have brought from the past is only as relevant as it helps for the future. And we must consciously set aside all the past influences and formations and tendencies so that we may leap forward without any baggage for this new work of the new consciousness and the new world that is waiting to manifest. The more in our consciousness we belong to the new world, the more easily we are able to make this leap without things pulling us back or slowing us down. But this must be consciously cultivated in us in this way. So this detailed memory is of minor importance to nature in her normal work. It is the shaping of the future evolution of the being with which she is concerned. The past is put back, kept behind the veil, and used only as an occult source of materials for the present and the future. And the next paragraph says, this conception of personality and person must modify at the same time our current ideas about immortality of the soul. So what is the sense of immortality that we should have, and how do we develop this? We will take up next Sunday. We can meditate on this for a few minutes.